Standing on the southern cliffs of Spain on a clear day, you can see it. Across the narrow blue ribbon of the Strait of Gibraltar, the dark, rugged peaks of the Moroccan coast rise out of the Mediterranean. It is a distance of just 14 kilometers, a mere stone's throw in global geography. Yet for centuries, this tiny stretch of water represented one of the most impenetrable borders in human history. In the 16th century, the Spanish Empire was an unstoppable global juggernaut. Its armies dominated Europe, its navies ruled the oceans, and its conquistadors toppled the mighty Aztec and Inca empires thousands of miles away. The Spanish crown laid claim to millions of square kilometers in the Americas, creating an empire on which the sun never set, and yet, right at its doorstep, the massive continent of Africa remained virtually untouched by Spanish rule. How did an empire capable of conquering the New World fail to project its power just 14 kilometers to the south? Why did Spain, a nation forged in crusading zeal, stop at the water's edge? To answer this, we must look beyond the myth of colonial invincibility and examine a complex web of geography, disease, military parity, and the irresistible lure of gold. To understand Spain's relationship with Africa, we must go back to the year 1492. It was a year defined by two historic events: the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas and the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. For nearly 800 years, Christian kingdoms in Spain had fought the Reconquista, a relentless holy war to reclaim the peninsula from Islamic rule. When Granada fell, the crusading energy of the Spanish military was at its peak. Battle-hardened soldiers and religious zealots were suddenly left without a war to fight. The logical next step was obvious: cross the strait. Queen Isabella herself urged her successors to keep up the crusade and conquer North Africa. Initially, Spain tried. In the early 1500s, Spanish forces captured key coastal fortresses and ports like Melilla, Oran, Algiers, and Tripoli. These coastal outposts, known as presidios, were meant to be stepping stones for a grand conquest of the African interior. But the grand conquest never came. The stepping stones became isolated islands of Spanish steel, surrounded by a sea of hostile territory. The first and most decisive reason Spain abandoned its African ambitions was a matter of distraction, or rather, attraction. Just as Spanish commanders planned pushes into the African interior, ships began returning from across the Atlantic. They brought back tales of vast, unexplored continents, cities built on lakes, and most importantly, gold. In Africa, the Spanish faced a grueling war of attrition against fiercely independent, heavily armed populations for very little immediate economic return. The lands of North Africa were dry, rugged, and defended by kingdoms that had fought Europeans for centuries. In contrast, the Americas offered a dazzling opportunity. In the New World, small bands of conquistadors could exploit internal divisions, utilize devastating epidemics of Old World diseases to which the native populations had no immunity, and seize vast fortunes. When the silver mines of Potosi and Zacatecas began pouring wealth into the Spanish treasury, Spain's geopolitical gaze shifted permanently westward. The strategic value of Africa plummeted. Why bleed resources trying to conquer the rocky hills of Morocco when a single silver fleet from Havana could fund the entire empire? Africa was relegated to a defensive sideshow. Even if Spain had ignored the Americas, conquering Africa would have been a monumental task. The Spanish were not dealing with isolated, technologically disadvantaged societies. They were facing peer competitors. In North Africa, the military balance of power was highly sophisticated. To the west, Morocco was ruled by powerful dynasties, most notably the Saadians. These rulers possessed modern gunpowder weapons, professional armies, and highly effective cavalry. They were masters of desert warfare. When Portugal, Spain's neighbor, attempted a full-scale invasion of Morocco in 1578, it resulted in the catastrophic Battle of Alcácer Quibir. The Portuguese army was annihilated and their king killed. This was a sobering lesson for Madrid. The African interior was a graveyard for European armies. Furthermore, to the east lay the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans established a powerful naval presence in the Mediterranean, allying with local corsairs and turning cities like Algiers and Tunis into heavily fortified bases. The Mediterranean became a theater of brutal, stalemated warfare. Every Spanish attempt to push inland was met with swift, devastating counterattacks backed by Ottoman artillery. Spain was forced onto the defensive, spending fortunes just to maintain its isolated coastal garrisons. Beyond the army stood the ultimate defenders of the African continent: geography and biology. For centuries, the Sahara Desert acted as a colossal, impassable wall. Even if a European power managed to conquer the Mediterranean coast, they could go no further south. The logistics of moving 16th-century armies across thousands of miles of arid wasteland were non-existent. Further south along the tropical coasts of West and Central Africa, Spain faced an even deadlier enemy: disease. Unlike the Native Americans, who suffered catastrophic mortality from European diseases, Europeans in Africa were the ones who died en masse. Tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever decimated any European military force that attempted to stay on the mainland. Lacking genetic immunities, soldiers died within weeks of landing. Because of this biological barrier, early European contact with sub-Saharan Africa was strictly limited to coastal trading factories, where Europeans traded for gold and enslaved people from the safety of their ships. True territorial conquest of the African interior was impossible until the mid-19th century, when the discovery of quinine and steamships finally breached Africa's natural defenses. By the time the Industrial Revolution gave Europe the technological tools to colonize Africa in the late 1800s, the era of the scramble for Africa, the geopolitical board had completely changed. Spain was no longer the global superpower it had been in the 16th century. Centuries of economic mismanagement, endless European wars, and the devastating loss of its American colonies in the early 19th century had left Spain exhausted, bankrupt, and politically fractured. When the great powers of Europe gathered at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to carve up the African continent, Spain was a minor player, barely able to secure the scraps left behind by Britain and France. They were granted only a small protectorate in northern Morocco, the barren sands of the Western Sahara, and the tiny enclave of Equatorial Guinea. History is often written as a series of inevitable conquests, where the strong simply consume the weak. But the story of why Spain never conquered Africa reveals a much more fragile, calculated reality. It reminds us that empires are not all-powerful machines. They are limited by the cold realities of geography, the biological barriers of disease, the strategic choices of their rulers, and the fierce resistance those they wish to conquer. Spain looked across the 14 kilometers of the Strait of Gibraltar and chose to turn its back. It chose the illusion of endless gold in the west over the formidable reality of the African continent in the south. And in doing so, it left the massive continent at its doorstep unconquered. a quiet testament to the limits of imperial power.